everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr Craig Lamont. Hello, Craig.
Hi, Ali.
And we're here to talk about your book, which I'm going to hold up to the camera for the video viewers. And it is The Cultural Memory of Georgian Glasgow. And I've only dipped in, I haven't read through the whole thing yet. You understand?
That's all right.
I'm already fascinated by it. Even the fact that on the cover, that's the Tron, isn't it?
That is, yeah.
So that's just round the corner from where I used to live, which excites me.
I know.
Really. Well, we'll get into place in a minute, but
yeah,
as with a lot of academic things, people say, define your terms. So what is cultural memory? How would you describe cultural memory?
Well, I'm not going to try and do my sort of spiel that I give in the book itself, but I do define it in the book. I mean, it's an academic field in itself, memory studies, and the academics argue over what it means all the time. But to put it quite simply, cultural memory is the sort of leftover remnants, culturally speaking, of an era in time that we can access through objects, art, literature, things like that, contrasted with collective memory, which is we were all alive to witness or hear about something. So then that creates a collective memory of a world event. People often say the JFK assassination or 9/11. Cultural memory for something like Georgian Glasgow is very important because it was hundreds of years ago. So we rely on second-hand accounts, paintings like the one on the front cover, things like that. So very much not a collective memory, but something that we can access through culture.
Right. So it's almost the objects themselves kind of hold, and the places themselves hold the story.
That's it. Yeah, that's pretty much how it works. And it's been fun to look at a city that way. I mean, I say a city, for me, it would have had to have been Glasgow. You know, that's where we're from. That's what we know. I think the book was kind of also hopefully intended to be a blueprint for other places that might access their past in that way, especially neglected pasts, because obviously Glasgow's a Victorian city on the face of it. So it was important to use these memory theories, to use metaphors like amnesia, to use metaphors like forgotten, to bring out the fact that look at all this great Georgian stuff that's just below the surface. You have to kind of draw it out of the archive. That was kind of the running metaphor for it, you know.
And Georgian Glasgow, it's kind of part of the long 18th century, the Georgian period, isn't it? Which basically means it's more than 100 years. What kind of parameters have you put in terms of time?
Well, the timeline at the start of the book, it kind of looks at the Union. So obviously the Georgian period begins 1714, but the Union is too important an event really to not begin with. So it does blur the edges a wee bit. And within the book itself, there is a lot of reflection on the Victorian period. So obviously a lot of academic books, mine included, is a sort of spin-off of the PhD thesis. And in the PhD thesis, which was a lot longer than this, a lot chunkier and probably a lot more waffly, if I'm being honest, I do take a lot of pride in the fact that this book is a more refined version of some of the arguments I had. But in the exam, I remember being told that I seemed to have had it in for the Victorians, you know, like I was almost angry at them for creating such a splendid city that's made us forget Georgian Glasgow. And I did take the point, but what I've tried to do with this book is say, right, we have to then look at, to understand Georgian Glasgow, you then have to consider the Victorian period as well, because it's the Victorians who either changed Georgian Glasgow by building over it, or they remembered things that happened in the Georgian era, such as the Jacobite risings, and then remembering those events and changing the sort of, I don't know how to put it, the stance, the sort of Scottish or Glaswegian stance on the Jacobite risings over time. Then by the time we come along and try and study it, we're not just accessing Georgian Glasgow through a history book, but we're accessing it through all these different perceptions and interpretations of any event that might have happened. So the core of the book is maybe the Union up until the end of the Georgian period, but then there's a sort of new section where I look at how the Victorians displayed their past in the great exhibitions. So the one in 1888, for example, those really form that image of Glasgow that's been set in stone. And a part of it is to say the Georgian period was sort of washed over, you know.
So basically you've taken the long 18th century and made it even longer.
Yeah, which is, you know, I would love to have had a multi-volume thing going on here, but yeah, no, I've made it even longer for the purposes of not just taking it in isolation, because if I was doing it in isolation, it would have just been a history of Georgian Glasgow. But to take it from this other angle of memory, you have to sort of say, right, well, when did we sort of start to neglect it, or what happened to make us more proud of maybe shipbuilding, for example, you know? So I like to draw out those things, although maybe there's the case to be made that you then miss out on some things. But I just think I like to see it as a fresh approach to something that we do need to try and think about.
And over that period, how did Glasgow grow in terms of numbers and size? I mean, because it was fairly small from what we know to begin with.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I'm looking here at my own timeline. I quite enjoy doing that. I mean, it didn't break the 100,000. By 1801, there were still only 77,000 inhabitants. So we're talking there's only 30 plus years of the Georgian era left, and that was not a great amount of people. But the way that Georgian Glasgow grew, and the way that we try and think about it now, I think, is that it was a mercantile town. It was also a university town. And it had the benefit of being both of those things at once. So you had a merchant class and you had the Scottish Enlightenment hand in hand. What you didn't have in Edinburgh, by comparison, where you had pretty much all the Scottish literati and you had the concentration of your Adam Smiths and your David Humes, you had that in abundance, but you didn't have the sort of industrialisation. The early industrialisation didn't really happen there. It started to happen in Georgian Glasgow while the Scottish Enlightenment was at its height. So it was a very unusual combination of early industry, you know, early trading. Transatlantic trading was one of the biggest benefits to Glasgow, and we'll get on to slavery perhaps, but I do cover that in the book. And that whole trade itself did, and has certainly recently started to define what we talk about when we're thinking about the 18th century. Glasgow being a transatlantic port in that sense is really where the wealth came from. It was that extreme influx of wealth that you didn't always see where it came from, because a lot of the trading obviously was done from Greenock or Port Glasgow. So the town itself didn't explode in the Georgian period, but the agents of change were very much in Glasgow at that time, in the manor houses, and collaborating with the great and good of the university.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you talk about the Scottish Enlightenment period and people's perception of it, because most people go straight to Edinburgh when they talk about Scottish Enlightenment, the Athens of the North and all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
I often think of the two cities as being, one was the theoretical, the philosophical more so, although it was happening in Glasgow, but then you had this more practical aspect, the kind of science and medicine in particular, which I think you touch upon in the book.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you're absolutely right. We do have, I mean, it's funny because when you talk about the theoretical, and then when we apply that to Edinburgh, a lot of people take on Adam Smith as the sort of, you know, the big talking head for that stuff. But his time in Glasgow was very, very crucial as well. And I think a lot of people struggle with the sort of concept of Adam Smith in Glasgow, because he's not much of a suitable frame for the Glaswegian state of mind. I do propose this in the book. And I think for a lot of that, it's because maybe the reason why the Scottish Enlightenment hasn't survived in the sort of Glasgow cultural memory until maybe recently it started to come out a wee bit, is because Glasgow's more proud of the working class element, the Red Clyde side, the sort of not taking in the sort of smithy and free trades tropes that we get from Edinburgh and the upper classes. And so Smith's time in Glasgow, crucial as it is, has been sort of ignored or neglected in favour of a more practical Enlightenment, which certainly did happen at Glasgow. You had Joseph Black was there, Cullen was there, Tobias Smollett was there, and those were the practitioners of medical advancement. I mean, the interesting thing is they all did at some point, I think with the exception of Smollett, they all went to Edinburgh anyway. So there was a sort of route from Glasgow to Edinburgh to London, or sometimes just Glasgow to London. William Hunter being another big name as well. So yeah, it's amazing, because I think maybe Glasgow had everything at one stage, but the proliferation of it seems to have just faded in the face of Edinburgh having a more clear version of it, if you know what I'm saying. So it wasn't, maybe Edinburgh was, it definitely was the most central location for it. I'm not trying to detract from Edinburgh's merits in that sense, but it's become the case that it's so often cited that things happened in Edinburgh that we don't really realise that they also happened in Glasgow, or that the groundwork for a lot of those advancements happened in Glasgow.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying about people leaving, because that kind of, until perhaps recently, was the thing that people thought about almost anything you did. Well, if you really want to make it politics or arts or music, then you got to get out of Glasgow and go somewhere else.
Yeah, no, you're right. And there's things said about, I think it's Cullen. I'm trying to remember now. I'm trying to remember the other names, but I think when Cullen went from Glasgow to Edinburgh, all the students just went with him. Apparently, the students who really enjoyed his stuff and thought this is the man for me. I'm going to apply my trade based on his teachings. It's like they went, and obviously the system was different back then. I think it was ticketed, so they just said, well, I'll go there, and that must have been devastating for Glasgow's Enlightenment. And one of the things I try and do as well is to set the parameters of the Scottish Enlightenment, not to shorten it, but to say that, when they all left, and when William Hunter died, especially, James Watt was still kicking around doing his thing, but the heyday of the Scottish Enlightenment was very much over. So on the one hand, it did happen at Glasgow, but when they all left or died out, Glasgow had realised that when I say Glasgow, I mean the university in this case, had realised they had something great, and they tried to enshrine it and talk about it and put up new buildings and institutions and advertise their legitimacy as a centre of enlightenment. But by then it had all actually went, so they'd missed the boat in a sense, and I try and touch on that as well.
So they were almost promoting something that had stopped.
Yeah, that's the impression I get, especially in the early 19th century. It's almost as if they realised what amazing things had happened. I mean, there was a poem called Glasgow by a poet called John Mayne, and he talks about, Smith was here and he wrote The Wealth of Nations based on things here, and Hunter and Cullen, and he actually name drops everyone, and they republished it in London in the early 19th century as if it was like a booster poem. It was as if to say, look what Glasgow had, but by then it had all gone, so maybe that's a sort of another reason why Edinburgh has remained in our minds the sort of centre of that Enlightenment,
And so who were the Glasgow Enlightenment figures that you think have been overlooked? Are there any that you would like to kind of talk about?
Yeah, certainly. The ones that I certainly had the most fun researching were the Phillips Brothers, Robert and Andrew Phillips. They were involved in everything. I mean, they were the official printers to the university from the 1740s, the early 1740s. Robert Phillips was the older brother, and his younger brother Andrew came along and started helping him out. And what's fascinating about them is they represent something quite unique in Glasgow University's history. So Robert started off as a bookseller. He then travelled to Paris, and they saw that there was a lot to be had with dealing art as well, like the old Dutch masters. And so he started collecting paintings and having them shipped back to Glasgow, and he saw how art schools were run and things like that. So all at the same time, when he came home, he established the Academy of Fine Art, or the Phillips Academy as we call it, in the 1750s. And he was still printing the classics. He was still printing Homer. He was still printing Virgil. He was printing some Alan Ramsay, but mostly they focused on the classics, and they were winning prizes for it. But the crucial thing is that their press only became renowned because they had the help of another university person who's been overlooked, and that was Alexander Wilson. And he was a type founder. So he actually collaborated with them to create a more recognisable and distinct publishing service for the university. But what's fascinating about Wilson is he was also an astronomer. Right. And to this day, there's still what they call the Wilson effect to do with sunspot activity. And there's whole, research areas out there that are to do with astronomy and science in that sense that still use Wilson's findings. So you had a printer who turned to publishing, who turned to founding an Academy of Fine Art in the university, who collaborated with an astronomer. And while this all happened, Smith was there at the university as well. So that period in the university's history was like the absolute apex of the Enlightenment there. It's also the same time where the likes of Smith and Robert Phillips would have meetings with John Glassford, who obviously had a lot of shipping interests and a lot of interest in the Americas, and was directly involved in chattel slavery. So there's the complication that comes out of that as well. And it was one of famous Glassford portrait that hangs in the People's Palace that has the black servant on the left-hand side of it. It was one of Fowlis's pupils in the Art Academy that painted that, and it's one of his only renowned works, but it's because of that infamous attachment that it has, you know. So there's a whole network going on in Glasgow that these two brothers, Robert and Andrew Phillips, were very much a part of, and they seem to have been forgotten completely. There is a paving stone in Ingram Street outside the kirkyard there. So Ingram Street, we're talking the Ramshorn Theatre.
Yeah.
And there's a paving stone set into the pavement that's in the shape of like a book, essentially. So it has the spine and their names are on it, and that's quite an interesting wee thing to look for their story.
Is that on the pavement outside or in the actual graveyard itself?
That's on the pavement outside. So that's actually just outside the gates to the Ramshorn. People literally walk all over it every day.
I must have done that almost daily for about 20 years and not noticed that. So there are these, it must have been quite exciting to go and kind of find where all these memories were.
Yeah, as I think that was one of the first things I tried to do, because in the PhD years, part of the premise was that I would work with Glasgow Life, Glasgow museums to contribute in some way and to learn from them about how an exhibition was set up and run. And so I was looking for physical markers. You know, I would spend half my time thinking about trying to wrap my head around the history, because if I'm being completely honest, before 2012, I didn't really know much about the Georgian period at all. I had to become knowledgeable quickly about it, and that was exciting in itself, because the pace of discovery made it that I was very much invested in sharing it, you know, and talking about it in a way that I thought would be quite interesting. So finding the physical markers in the city was the first thing, you know, because it's like, right, well, why is it I've not known about this? Is it like this for other people too? And just by walking around the town, you are confronted very much with a beautiful city, but one that the Georgian aspects are sort of hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, I think that's right. So when you were looking at it, you kind of, there's an area of history here that has gaps that really need to be filled.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is about Glasgow is we talk about shipbuilding so much, and we talk about trade and engineering. You know, there's a proud history of all of that, and the irony is, it's as if we've said it started in the Victorian period, it started with Fairfield, it started at Govan, but the history of that goes further back into the city centre, into that old part that sort of we built over and we moved west, and we set up new communities, and the university moved to the West End as well. But the history of all of that stuff, you know, really from the weaving and all the rest of it, started right in the heart of the city, and in the Georgian period.
Because a lot of this took place round about this, what I think of as the spine of the high street, wasn't it? And that's
exactly.
It was there. I think medical school was up there as well.
Yeah. So you had that's exactly right. So pretty much from the cathedral all the way down the high street to the cross, you had the university, you had the other teaching houses on the high street opposite, and then down at the riverfront on Clyde Street, you had the town's hospital, the first proper hospital in Glasgow. And I think that there's a records book from the Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow that shows that a lot of the medical literati, if we call them that, who were in Glasgow, who then went to Edinburgh, would likely have practiced at the town's hospital. And I think that was established in the 1720s or 30s. And the building's no longer there. That's one of the, as with a lot of this book, you're looking at paintings or engravings of buildings that are no longer there. So it's always exciting when it is, because you can go visit it. But the town's hospital was kind of like the end point, if you want, of that spine from the cathedral all the way down. Because obviously at the cathedral as well, you would have the Royal Infirmary in 1791 was built there. So still that spine right up until the end of the 18th century was the main hub of activity for medical practicing and university teaching, and how they started to coexist.
And was that when the necropolis was built?
The necropolis was laid out in the 1820s or 30s, and the John Knox statue, I want to say, was 1825. So that was and is still the sort of tallest standing structure there. But the necropolis, right on the back of I think it was Fir Park it was called, not Motherwell Football Club, but Fir Park as in the name of the green behind the necropolis. And there's some beautiful paintings of that view. So I think the great thing about when you think about cultural memory is you try and find images that are echoes. So you've pointed to the front cover and how you can see the Tron. You can do that today. You can go and stand and have a look down that exact avenue and see what's different. Obviously, a lot of it is. But in the 1690s, there was I think he was Dutch. There was a guy who took engravings of Glasgow, and he took a view up by where the necropolis is of the cathedral and the surrounding sort of buildings. And it's stunning because someone in the 1840s then painted the same scene. And so you take both of those together and you sort of superimpose them, however you want to do it. And you can see through time the way that the Georgian period, you can see the steeples, you can see the smoke from the chimneys of early industry. It's pretty much all there from how it started off as in the late 17th, early 18th century as a small, probably religious town, you would call it, or a centre of fishing, into this sort of mercantile hub of activity, and certainly not, smog-covered skies the way that we would then come to understand Glasgow, but certainly the beginnings of it. So it's very interesting.
So in a way, you talk about in the introduction, you talk about how Glasgow kind of self-image is created by almost anecdote and well-worn tropes, if you like. People talk about shipbuilding, tea, tobacco, the things that we kind of all know. Did you see it as your job to almost join these together? Say, well, they did exist, or they do exist, but what came before them and what came between them?
Yeah, exactly. So I wasn't trying to discredit or take away from these themes. And you're right that, that's the thing when it comes to identity and civic pride, is that these themes didn't just come out of nowhere. So I wanted to know where did they come from, and have we sort of come to a point now where not that they're not as valuable, but have they maybe been misunderstood or like passed through the generations with a little bit of liberties taken regarding the truth. So it was to see where they came from and maybe interrogate a little bit if there's other things that are more realistic. Like that old saying, the Clyde made Glasgow, Glasgow made the Clyde. I might have got it the wrong way around, but that's a famous one because the city is very much dependent on its river. But the ironic thing for me is that a lot of the shipping happened at Port Glasgow and Greenock. So the Clyde didn't actually get dredged and deepened until well into the Victorian period. And by then you're talking about the fact that Glasgow had already created a foundation of wealth based on just using other capabilities. So that Clyde theme has always been one that I've tried to interrogate, because it seemed to me a little bit too reductive. And I thought, if it's clear to everyone in history that the Clyde wasn't opened up until a certain time, how can we treat that river as this sort of eternal spring well of wealth and of goodness, because even the poets were guilty of it. The poets of that time would talk about the river as this holy thing that had created Glasgow, but it's the Mull and Diner burn up at the cathedral where the whole St Mungo legend comes from. So it's a different treacle of water altogether, and I just wanted to sort of reposition it almost.
But I think most cities probably have this, but Glasgow certainly has this thing about the folk tales and the anecdotes become text, they become facts.
Yeah.
And you look into them and think, well, I didn't know until about 10 years ago maybe that the Clyde had been widened so much to allow the ships right into the heart of Glasgow, and before that they were kind of nowhere near it. Yeah,
that's right. And there's even in maps, that's one of the things that I've became sort of obsessed with maps, and maybe you have to during this sort of research, but it's funny when you look at a map of, say, Glasgow in 1770, and there's wee motifs all around it, and there's maybe a couple of ships, and there's maybe a barrel for maybe some fish or something like that, and then you go to like 1850, and the whole bottom of the map's just teeming with masts and sails, because obviously that's the ships are all here now, that's it, we've opened it up. And so it's kind of like a visual, and the visuals are very important when it comes to memory, and Glasgow has a lot of visual identikits. The four legends of St Mungo are dotted everywhere in the city, and it's always been a bit of a source of pride for me that the cathedral still stands, and that those elements of Glasgow's foundation are very much still part of the civic identity, no matter what religious sectarian divide still exists. I think that's quite interesting.
And how was Glasgow viewed by the rest of the world during this period?
Well, there's one little example I like to look at where there was a French author, I think he was Charles Nodier, and I think he had come over to Glasgow and had written a novel. I want to say it was called The Crumb Fairy. Right. I think that I don't know the French for it, and I'm not going to try and do it here. But he actually references a couple of the Glasgow medics in it, and I think he spends time in one of the asylums in a sort of reportage sort of way, and just that sort of European view of Glasgow at the time. It certainly seems that they're aware that it was a centre, and you've already mentioned here today, Ali, that the medical and the scientific aspect of Glasgow was one of the most clearly defined parts of the Scottish Enlightenment. Europe certainly seemed to see it the same way. There's a lot of connections between the people in Glasgow who practiced it in Leiden, for example, or who went to Paris. And so I think the continental Europe had a good view of Glasgow as a burgeoning place of enlightenment, especially where medicine was concerned. But thanks to the Phillips Brothers, not to mention them too often, they certainly gave Glasgow a reputation for fine printing. I mean, they became a very well-known name in Europe. So I think they were called the Elzevers of Glasgow, and I'm blanking on where they're from, but that name was the biggest name in printing in Europe in the 17th century, and the Phillips Brothers styled themselves as something equivalent to them for the 18th century, and their reputation, especially for their fine books, did travel across the continent. So yeah, it was looked on favourably, but I dare say that by the mid to late 18th century, it started to become the case that Glasgow was known more for being a town of trade and a merchant class who were very much about increasing the wealth of their town and showing off that wealth with splendid new buildings. Whereas Edinburgh, on the other hand, and I would cite Murray Pittock's book on Edinburgh for a clear view of how continental Europe had a better view of Edinburgh during the 18th century, certainly for those things. But yeah, globally, I think Glasgow has more to say for itself in the 19th century and then into the Victorian period, but it's a tricky one. And I think that the book tries to look at Glasgow on the face of it and then start to uncover what we've forgotten. But one thing that I could look at in the future is how globally Glasgow was defined during that period. It's an interesting question.
And you mentioned in slavery, and that maybe is the subject more than any other, where which had been overlooked, perhaps for obvious reasons. Certainly when I was younger, it was never really discussed, Glasgow's role in this. But yet, as you say, it's hidden in plain sight. It's on the street names, and it's in the buildings and all of those things. What can you say about that? Because it's quite a central part to the book.
Yeah, well, what I would say about that is that there's a problem today where there are people who want to. The problem derives from the fact that some parts of society just don't want to believe this could have happened, and I understand that it's because people are proud of their identity and their past. And whether you class yourself as Scottish or British, I think there's people who would class themselves as both, who just don't want this part of Glasgow's history to be at the face of it, because they think, right, but England, where Liverpool was worse, or look at America, there was worse things being done there. And it's almost a bit of, I don't know if you would call it shame, or if you would say that they just think it's unnecessary. But on the other hand, you have everyone, and not everyone in the academy, but you have people all across the cultural spectrum who say no, but the point is we recognise that this shouldn't have happened. Yeah. It's helped build up the wealth of our city. There's studies done into how the city chambers, with all its, the city chambers in Glasgow, 1887 or 1888, so built pretty much on a lot of slavery wealth. It's like, nobody's saying we're going to tear that down, right? Nobody's saying we're going to take it down brick by brick, but there's nothing wrong with saying, here's a splendid building that we have and that we use, but we have to say there's a darker history that sort of influenced the wealth of the city. So what I would say is, my book tries to address some of the foundational moments in the 18th century where slavery was discussed, abolition was discussed. I try and draw out the sort of heroes and villains almost, because you had Adam Smith, who seemed to be very much anti-slavery, but in The Wealth of Nations, he's sort of pining for civilization to take the next step forward and to become globally enriched, and that very much did depend on servitude that depended on there being a lower class. And that, again, is why Adam Smith is one of the more complicated figures when it comes to this sort of thing. So slavery is central because it's there in the built environment, but especially since 2020, people are now asking, is that a suitable representation of our town? The Colston statue in Bristol, for example, I think I seen the other day Jeremy Clarkson, of all people, trying to say that we're all daft for wanting to make any sort of mark on this. And I think that just shows the widespread ignorance and the fact that, how dare you have an opinion on something, or how dare you want to ease the pains of history by admitting things happened. We're not talking about, dismantling or renaming Glasgow. We're talking about elevating other parts of the history alongside what we already have. And I think that's the important distinction.
I was at the beginning there when you said, but Bristol was worse or Liverpool was worse.
Yeah.
Even in something like this, that kind of whataboutery that you get
in
football.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's prevalent. It's so
stupid,
but I completely understand that's what it's like. And I'm sure now we've got to the stage where, anyone who denies that it happened, surely the weight of evidence is just there. And going back to the idea of cultural memory, it's essential. You can't have a memory where you're deliberately, forgetting parts of it. Seeing the memory that you want to see. If you're going to look at the whole thing, you have to look at the whole thing. And as you say, it's in the art, it's in the buildings, it's in the, the writing at the time. And it's just uncovering that, I guess.
Yeah. Do you know what's fascinating as well, though, Ali, is that even with the evidence and the facts laid out, these things are so heated and contested that you can lay out facts or archival evidence or science even, and you can say, here's things that happened. But if it doesn't align with what someone wants to believe, they'll still rubbish it. Like, for example, in 2007, the bicentenary of the passing of the Slave Trade Act or the Abolition Act, I can't remember which one was 1807, but there was a lot of commemorative events done throughout Britain that year to say, here's a part of our past, we're not proud of it, but we're going to commemorate it and say, here's the evidence. So there was, in the People's Palace, there was a whole exhibition dedicated to the Glassford portrait. Mm-hmm. And part of the redisplay of it was the fact that they had conservators in, they had X-ray work done on it to uncover the black servant who was in the picture. And this is probably the biggest, most potent lightning rod for Glasgow and slavery, is this image. Yeah. And the myth that had survived from the 70s, maybe well before that, was that the family, the Glassford family, or some sort of very shamefaced Glaswegian curator once upon a time had painted over him. Yeah. But the evidence is that it wasn't ever painted over, but that the varnish had gathered dust and dirt and that it was just obscured, so it had to be cleaned up. Now, the ironic thing is, even with all that evidence, as long ago as 2007, there are still commentators today using the word cover-up, using the word of neglected, forgotten, amnesia based on a lie almost, but you have to then keep reiterating it. So when it was displayed in 2014 as well, as part of the How Glasgow Flourished exhibition, there was attempts made to say, here's this painting, there's a slave in it, we're talking about slavery here, and people are still neglecting the fact that Glasgow ever had this past. And that's what astounds me. That's where memory is important, because myth versus fact is one of the big tropes here. It's the same with Robert Burns, one of the most mythic icons in Scotland. It's like all the things that you could disprove about Burns, people will still believe it because it's famous, it's popular, and it's maybe the more enjoyable part of his past or whatever it is.
It's the headline, isn't it? The clickbait of the Georgian period.
That's it. That's it. You've coined a new phrase. Historical clickbait is a thing we have to investigate.
Let's talk a little bit about how Glasgow was represented in literature at the time, and even now, the way that it is. But one of my favourite scenes in any book is going back to the High Street. It's in Walter Scott's Rob Roy. And he goes out of the prison, which is at the bottom of High Street, just before Saltmarket, and he goes up to the cathedral. So you've got that spine, and I was living on High Street at the time, so it was like, he was
more fun
right outside my window, which I love. But so how was the literature at the time using Glasgow?
It's funny, that was because of my sort of background in working with yourself and publishing and just being interested in writing in general. My first hope was, I'm going to find all the sort of the big hitters of literature back then and try and draw them out a wee bit. And I bet you there's loads of forgotten ones. But the ironic thing was the biggest Glasgow name probably in terms of poetry back then was Thomas Campbell, and he writes about Glasgow maybe 3 times in total. He was more interested in writing about North America. He wrote Ye Mariners of England. You know, we're talking about, the problem here is Britain is becoming a very powerful idea, and the empire is a very attractive prospect for a lot of writers. And so to assign themselves the role of promoting empire and colonization, they sometimes neglect their roots. And you've said already today that sometimes it's getting out and then looking back, you know, and that's when things start to appear. Tobias Smollett writes about Glasgow in his first novel, and then in his last novel, he sort of does a tour in the expedition of Humphrey Clinker. He does a sort of tour of Scotland, and he points out, look at the famous observatory of Glasgow University, look at Clydebank, then we'll go to Edinburgh, and that whole thing was just a fun sort of retrospective. He's almost gathering up the best things about Glasgow. So that there are representations, but they're not as well spread as you would hope they would be. Sometimes you really do have to go looking for them. One of my favourite ones is that you have the novel. So there's another big name to mention if I can, but there's a novel called Cyril Thornton written by a guy called Thomas Hamilton. I think it was the 1820s it was published. And it's about a guy who grows up in Glasgow, moves away and comes back. And when he comes back, he finds that the Hunterian Museum has been built on the old campus. And he's horrified by this because the beauty of the old campus is that it was a 17th century thing. It had, for them, it was old, it was romantic. And now this new 1820s building is plopped down in front of it. And they say that the line is, it's as if it's dropped from the heavens, and it just ruins the effect. Now, for us sitting here in the 21st century, we're like, I'd love to have seen that. Now it's been assumed into the new campus. So we're talking about layers upon layers of reference to different things that happened that you have to go looking for. The biggest name in prose for Glasgow literature is definitely John Galt. Yeah. He obviously is most famous for Annals of the Parish, and that's the sort of Irvine parish town of, and Glasgow's at the edges of it. Liam McIlvanney writes about this really well, about how Glasgow's like a spectre in that novel. All the improvements that are happening in Glasgow start to creep into Irvine and the surrounding parishes. And he also, Galt has a whole network of reference for Glasgow growing. And one of the best ways that he does that, because he writes a lot about revolution, during the French Revolution, he was quite active in writing about that time. So what's interesting about him is he talks about the streets growing in Glasgow almost the same way that they would emanate from a weaver's web, and that's beautiful because we're very proud of the weaving heritage in Glasgow. And here we have a Scottish writer who is using that metaphor to illustrate Glasgow's streets spreading out from its centre. So John Galt is definitely the main man for that, and he does actually represent in his fiction Glasgow as it's in the Georgian period. So even though he's writing in the 1820s and 30s, he looks back to the 1700s of Glasgow and he tries to capture it almost. So that in itself is a memory, and then we're accessing that memory, and it becomes a bit of a maze.
And this was also a time where Scots were going out to the world as well, weren't they? They were starting to travel. What was the effect of that?
One of my chapters looks at emigration and the fact that Scots who would go to Nova Scotia and Canada especially would try and bring a little bit of home with them. There's a famous sort of references to Scots who travelled across the Atlantic and would the seeds from their blankets that they carried over would create, heather would flourish on the hillsides there, and all that's very romantic. And we'll never say, maybe we will. We'll never say for sure whether or not that's the case, but it shows you the sort of the metaphor is beautiful for what Scots were wanting to do back then. The thing I find interesting to mention Galt again is that Galt very much saw emigration and travelling to North America as a fresh start. He mentions quite a lot of the time the old sort of bigoted ways of Scotland in that time. There was persecution was still rife. There was people holding prejudice against each other for witchcraft still back then. So there was a lot going on in Glasgow and in Scotland and in Britain that people thought now that we've got the best ideas of what society is, let's go somewhere else and start again. And Galt actually helped establish the town of Guelph, and he was acting as an agent for Britain when he'd done that, but he then wrote about it in the novel Bogle Corbett. That's the name of the guy. The character names are always very odd, but there's a beautiful passage in that book where he actually writes about Glaswegian workmen founding a new town, and they decide to call the town Stockwell because of Stockwell Street, with his pals, and he's cleared a large forest area and he's set up a town and they've planned it all out. What churches will be there? They want to represent every denomination, and they end up calling it Guelph, which is a reference to the royal Hanoverian seat. So it's quite funny because you've got in his fiction the sort of Glaswegian emanation across the Atlantic, but in reality he's like, well, they're paying my wages, I better give the monarchs a shout, you know. But the emigration's another huge part of it, and we talk about Scottish diaspora. There's other scholars who are a lot more well versed on talking about that. I try and touch on it in this book based on how Glasgow moves with these characters, with these people, and what sort of inflections of Glasgow appear across the Atlantic especially. But yeah, it was obviously a part of the whole exchange during the Georgian period of ideas and culture, where we had new communities coming in, but we would send people out as well. And yeah, that whole side of it's fascinating. I think a lot of the writers try to capture it in their works.
That's really interesting. A long time ago, I was at a conference in Spain, and I was sitting beside a guy from, I think he was from Germany, and he said, "Why is there no Scottish diaspora? There's the Irish diaspora, but there's no Scottish diaspora." I'm thinking, yes, there is, but
yeah.
Why isn't it better known? So I guess it's just because it hadn't been written about academically.
Yeah, exactly. I think the last 10 years or so, I mean, you've got a lot of big early 2000s, you've got a lot of the big historians who are still active now writing about empire, and they would focus a lot on the good aspect of it, if you know what I mean. Like they did, slavery and such was mentioned, but they were looking at how you can promote a Scottish imperial effort on its own, but obviously within the confines of, you know, it's still the United Kingdom of the UK back then. So you're talking about how the Scottish story was forgotten, and so that's, maybe you could see that as phase one of the Scottish diaspora. We talk about the empire. So which Scottish people were doing what and during the empire, and does that create a new idea of Scotland as a very forward-facing nation with its ills and its evil deeds in tow, as with any empire? And then nowadays you're saying, right, we understand more about which parts of history affected our city's growth directly, so we can actually tease them out and start to look at Glasgow's effect across the Atlantic as well. So yeah, there's been many scholars in the last 10 years, I'd say, especially, who have tried to increase the terms of that history.
And yeah, kind of end the book looking at the great exhibitions, as you say.
Yeah.
You say a bit about them, because I think a lot of people they maybe heard the name, but they wouldn't really be aware of what the great exhibitions were, particularly the main one.
Yeah, the big one in Glasgow in 1881, sorry, is that right? 1888? I think I'm getting my dates mixed up now, but I think it's 1888. But the biggest one that happened was in the Kelvin Grove area. Now, the fascinating thing about this is they tried to say that here's what Glasgow is, and they would put their mechanical structures in place. They would put their new feats in engineering would be on show. And I think there's writers, there's theorists throughout the last 30, 40 years who talk about modernism and who talk about early modernism, when the machine, the aspect of machinery and mechanical development started to replace or define a nation almost. So obviously mechanized warfare in the form of World War I hadn't happened yet, but what you start to see in those first Glasgow exhibitions is the power almost of engineering starting to supplant the old Scotland. And actually it gets quite comical, because during these exhibitions they did start to pastiche old Scotland. So in Glasgow there was the Bishop's Castle, that the ruins of the Bishop's Castle were still visible during the 18th century, until they built the Royal Infirmary, and they pulled them down, and then they built the Royal Infirmary on top of it. And it was a glorious moment, because they were saying, out with the old, in with the new, especially because the Bishop's Castle represented the Catholic past of Glasgow that a lot of the elite back then weren't too keen on remembering. The interesting thing is, by the late 19th century, Mary Queen of Scots is a romantic figure. The Bishop's Castle is something to be proud of. So what they do is they erect a sort of wooden and cloth, a very, to us, maybe a sham version of the real thing. But apparently in the guidebooks for these exhibitions, that it was so realistic that tourists would come up to it with their umbrellas and start poking at the walls to see if they were real. So they had actually, during the Victorian period, they had started to reclaim those parts of old Glasgow or old Scotland and said, let's have a look at them again. And they started to erect, fake versions of it. And I think that's fascinating, because we are thinking about what are the best ways to remember Georgian Glasgow. Is it in the museum? Is it by renaming streets? Is it by writing books and having conferences and things like that? But back then it was all about the show, the spectacle. And that's, for me, that's when the image of Glasgow was set in stone. That's when the older period, the Romantic period, the day of Burns and everything before was sort of seen as a little bit through the rose-tinted glasses. But the real serious business is industry, mechanical advancement. Let's go into the future. And I think it's quite pivotal that the exhibitions were the stage for that.
So the history almost becomes a drama with costume and the sets and all of that kind of thing. And the important stuff is the stuff that you can touch and, create. Yeah,
well, exactly. The future, the horizon of the 20th century must have been quite something for them. And you say costume. I think in the Bishop's Castle they had the waitresses as Mary Queen of Scots. They actually had them dressed up. So it's like a nation, a town who, and a nation indeed, who during her life absolutely reviled her at one point, and hounded her towards her execution, then starts to romanticize her. So that's what happens through history anyway. We know that. But in Glasgow, that was one of the things that amused me most. And it does, however, by the next few exhibitions, it takes on that sort of, it takes on a more, not a sinister gaze, but it takes on a bit of a not so politically correct gaze, I would say, because the good thing about these exhibitions is the first one was so popular that the next one in 1901 actually led to the construction of the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum. Mm-hmm. So that building was the showcase building. Before that, it was all temporary structures that were thrown up for the months that the exhibition ran. But 1901 marked the opening of the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery, which everyone in Glasgow loves. So that's something to be proud of. But during the next two exhibitions, they didn't know quite how to word them. You had the next one, the 1911 Scotland exhibition, which was very much a focus on old Scotland. The letters of Robert Burns, the poetry of Walter Scott. They had big busts of both of those authors made in soap. It was all very much about the novelty, the gaze into the past. But then in 1938, I think it was, you had the Empire exhibition in Glasgow. This time it was in Bellahouston Park. Yeah. Up until then, they were all held in the Kelvin Grove area. But the 1938 one was the last big one. And by then, they had still retained this sort of fantastical aspect of, let's create a little small village of Scotland. It wasn't so much Glasgow's village back then. They made the Clachan, right? And the Clachan was supposed to be a Highland village. But beside that, you had like an old African village as well. So this is the thing about this, is we're starting to delve into racial tropes here that make that whole period, the early 20th century, the gaze into the past was a little bit problematic, is the word you would use today, because geographically and historically, they've taken a big chunk of Scotland from probably the 1600s. They've dragged it down into the Bellahouston Park. They've then taken the Laplanders section, the African section, and they're all together. The crucial thing about this is you would get entry to the exhibition and walk around it, but you had to pay a fee to go and see these little parts. It was almost like a carnival almost. You would go in and see how the Africans lived, how the Laplanders lived, how the ancient Scots lived in the Highlands. And so for me, this is why I talk about the future so much, because by then the people who would attend these things would see themselves as modern. They would see themselves as very much part of a new identity. Call it British, Scottish, whatever you want. But for them, these glances into the past were almost novel. And I think that's quite an interesting thing.
Well, it's a fascinating book, Craig, absolutely. I can't wait to read the rest of it and go into it in detail.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks for chatting to us today. It's been great to catch up with you.
Yeah, you too. Always happy to talk to you. So it was good fun.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.